They crossed out my name from the wedding invitation of my own grandson and replaced it with the words, family guest. I watched the ceremony through a shaky live stream and heard my son thank his in-laws for helping buy their home, the same house I had been secretly paying for every month. I felt like a stranger at a party I helped build. But when I found out what they did with the house deed, something inside me shifted. What do you do when the family you built quietly writes you out of the story? The envelope came on a Tuesday, heavy cardstock, gold-trimmed edges, elegant lettering, the kind of thing you'd expect from a fancy wedding. My name was printed right there on the front, Mrs. Della Ronstadt. For a moment I smiled. I held it like it was something precious. I hadn't been part of much lately, so being included, well, that meant something. But when I opened it, everything changed. Inside, the formal invitation was clean, crisp, deliberate. But someone had taken a pen and crossed out my name. Not scribbled, not sloppy. A single, confident line right through it. And underneath, written in smaller handwriting, it said, plus one, family guest. Family guest. I sat in my kitchen holding that card like it might disappear if I blinked. I kept rereading the words, trying to understand what I was looking at. There was no mistake, no smudge, no apology note. It was clear. Someone had made the decision to erase me. I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry. I just sat there in the quiet, tracing my finger over the ink, over the line that used to be my name. And I thought so. This is how it happens. This is how you find out you don't belong anymore. I looked out the window. Snow hadn't started yet, but the sky had that heavy grey colour that warned you it was coming. That kind of silence before the first flake falls. The whole world holding its breath. I used to take Tobin to the park in this kind of weather, bundle him up in his little green jacket, the one with the missing zipper. He used to hold my hand so tight his knuckles turned white. That boy used to light up when he saw me at the gate. And now I was a guest. Not a grandmother. Not even a name. Maybe you understand that kind of quiet. The one that doesn't shout. It just seeps in through the cracks. The kind that makes you question if all those years of birthday cakes, school pickups, and late-night coughs were real, or if you just imagined being important. I tucked the invitation back into the envelope and set it on the counter. I didn't throw it out. I didn't tear it up. I left it there right next to the sugar bowl where I could see it every time I made tea. A reminder. Not of the wedding, but of the line that told me where I stood now. And if you've ever had your name crossed out from something you helped build, then maybe you already know. This wasn't just about an invitation. This was about being erased, quietly, neatly, like I was never meant to be there in the first place. And somehow that hurt more than anything they could have said out loud. The next afternoon, my phone rang. It was Spencer, my son. His name flashed on the screen like it always did, but this time I didn't answer right away. I just stared at it until the second ring, then the third. Eventually I picked up. His voice was smooth, too casual for what had happened. He said, "Hey, Mum, just wanted to make sure you got the invite." I said I did. Silence. Then he cleared his throat. "Listen, Laurel. She wanted to keep the guest list clean. You know, for the photos. She's very specific about the aesthetic." The aesthetic. He kept talking like he was explaining seating charts, not telling his mother she wasn't welcome as herself. He didn't stutter. He didn't sound guilty. His tone was calm, like we were discussing catering. He said, "We didn't want things to be weird with her side of the family. You understand, right?" I told him I understand. And I did. I understood that somewhere along the way I had become the kind of person they had to manage, someone they were willing to hide in the background just to keep the picture clean. He asked if I'd be coming anyway. I told him no. I said it plainly, not in anger, not with bitterness, just the truth. There was nothing for me to go to, not anymore. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He said, "Well, okay then. I guess we'll see you after." Then he hung up. I put the phone down and sat back in my chair. The kettle clicked off behind me, but I didn't move. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves scraped across the back patio in sharp little bursts. The air inside felt colder after that call, not because of anything he said, but because of what he didn't say. There was no hesitation in his voice, no pause before explaining Laurel's preferences, like I was just another name to rearrange an item on the list that didn't fit the vision. I had raised him to speak his mind, to be kind, to be honest. I thought I had taught him that love means showing up even when it's inconvenient. But now he sounded like someone who hadn't spoken to his mother in years, and maybe in his mind he hadn't. I thought about the last real conversation we had. It was months ago in spring. We sat on a bench after lunch, and he told me he was proud of how independent I was. I remember how he smiled when he said it like it was a compliment. Back then, I took it as one. Now I wondered if what he meant was that I made it easy for him to leave me out. I had made a life that didn't rely on anyone. No complaints, no demands. I thought I was giving him freedom. Instead, I had trained him to forget me. That was the hardest part. Not the missing seat at the wedding, not even the crossed-out name. It was realizing he didn't think I'd care, that he assumed I'd stay quiet like I always had. And he wasn't wrong, at least not yet. 2 days later, I walked through the Yale campus on my way to the museum. The air was crisp, just cold enough to make the tips of my fingers sting. I pulled my scarf tighter and kept moving. The trees had turned orange and rust and gold, the kind of color that made the buildings look older, but somehow warmer, too. I used to know every brick of this place. For 31 years I gave lectures here, not in grand halls or lecture theatres, but tucked away classrooms filled with students who didn't know what they didn't know. I loved that part. Watching their faces change as they started to care about things older than them, things that couldn't be Googled, artifacts that whispered stories if you knew how to listen. I retired 7 years ago, quietly. No party, no plaque, just handed in my keys and said thank you. Now the museum had a new exhibit opening, something modern, digital, interactive, a celebration of the future. I wasn't invited to the opening, but I showed up anyway, not to make a scene, just to see it with my own eyes. Inside, the space looked different, brighter, sleeker. My favorite bronze bust, the one I used to use as a centerpiece in my talks on post-colonial Europe, was moved to a corner behind a touchscreen display. No nameplate, just a QR code. A young woman stood at the reception desk. She wore a dark blazer and her hair in a tidy bun. She looked professional, polished. She smiled and said, "Welcome." I nodded. She asked if it was my first time visiting. I said no. I used to work here. Her smile didn't change. She said, "That's lovely, enjoy the show." That was it. No flicker of recognition, no pause, no curiosity. I could have been anyone. A tourist, a retiree with nothing better to do. And maybe I was. I walked slowly through the exhibit, letting the digital voices play in my ears. They were clean and clever, but they lacked warmth. Every station had a screen. Every screen had a story. But none of the stories were mine. I stood in the back corner near the exit and watched the crowd. College students, young couples, a few older visitors like me. They were engaged, interested, nodding along. The museum was thriving, which should have made me proud. Instead, I felt something I didn't expect. I felt erased. Not with malice, not out of spite, just quietly overwritten, like a page replaced in a book no one checks out anymore. On my way out, I glanced back at the main display, a wall-sized quote lit up in white letters. The future belongs to those who create it. For a moment, I thought about turning around, asking for someone in charge, saying my name aloud just to see if it landed. But I didn't. I stepped outside into the fading afternoon light. The wind cut sharper now. I pulled my coat closer and headed home. At the corner, I passed a group of students huddled around a food truck. One of them laughed loud and clear. The sound reminded me of Tobin when he was little, running through leaves in my yard, his shoes untied and cheeks red from the cold. I used to think memories were enough, that the love you give stays with people, that even if they move on, some part of you stays with them. But lately I've started to wonder if that's just something we tell ourselves, to make the silence easier to bear. 2 weeks after the museum visit, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by envelopes, contracts, and a calculator older than Tobin, the kind with the large green numbers and the stiff buttons. It still worked. I liked that about it. Things that were built to last had a way of making you feel grounded. Lately, I needed that feeling more than ever. I pulled out the folder marked Evelyn Brooke. That name wasn't real. It belonged to a woman I once knew who never married, never had children, and died alone. Years ago, I used her name to quietly establish a small LLC. It gave me a legal shell I could use to support Spencer and Laurel when they needed a cosigner for the mortgage on their new home. Back then, they were struggling to qualify. Laurel's parents had debt. Spencer's credit wasn't strong. I stepped in quietly through Evelyn Brooke Financial and guaranteed the loan. I made every monthly payment from that LLC. It was clean, discreet, separate from me. They never asked who was behind it. They never thanked me either. I didn't mind. I told myself it was a gift, a way to make their lives easier without making them feel indebted. At least that's what I believed. Now I was reading through the statements line by line, tallying up payments. 24 months. Due into $200 each month. $52,800 in total. I paused at the line showing the last automatic withdrawal. It had posted 2 days before the wedding invitation arrived. That irony settled in slowly like rain soaking into soil. I leaned back and looked out the window. Snow had finally come. The world outside was muted, the branches lined in white. A car passed by, slow and careful. Everything felt slower in that moment, like the house itself was waiting for me to decide what came next. I opened the second folder. It held the deed to Spencer's house. I had never looked at it before. I didn't think I needed to. But now I read every page, and what I saw made my fingers go cold. The deed listed 4 names, Spencer and Laurel, of course, and then Daniel and Celia Atwater, Laurel's parents. They were recorded as co-owners. There was no mention of Evelyn Brooke Financial, no reference to any secured loan from the LLC, no lien, no protective clause. I felt my pulse rise, not with anger, but with something sharper. A recognition. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. Somewhere along the line, Spencer had taken the support I gave and rewritten it. He had placed his in-laws on the deed, as if they were the ones who carried the weight, as if I had never existed. I flipped to the signature page. Laurel's handwriting was neat, practiced. Spencer's was slanted, fast, familiar. There were no crossed-out lines, no corrections, just confident strokes that declared ownership. I closed the folder and set it on the table beside the calculator. $52,800, 24 quiet deposits, and not one word, not one moment of acknowledgement. What settled in my chest wasn't rage, it was something heavier, The feeling you get when you realize you weren't forgotten by accident. You were removed, deliberately, and now for the first time I wasn't sure I could forgive that. The day of the wedding came quietly. I didn't mark it on the calendar, but I knew the date by heart. I woke early, though I hadn't planned to. The sky outside was pale, almost silver, and the house felt still in a way that made even the floorboards softer underfoot. I made coffee the way I always did. Same beans, same chipped blue mug. I sat by the window and waited for the sun to fully come up. There was nothing I needed to do, nowhere I needed to be. It was strange how empty a morning could feel when you knew your family was gathering without you. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I thought I might, but the tears never came. Instead, I moved through the motions of the day like I was walking underwater, slow, distant, like everything around me had thickened somehow. At noon, I opened my laptop. The link had been emailed days earlier by a distant cousin who assumed I'd want to watch. It led to a live stream of the ceremony. I hadn't decided if I would click it, but there I was staring at the screen. Then I clicked. The video loaded to the image of a white tent draped in soft fabric and strung with fairy lights, even in daylight. Guests were already seated. Rows of chairs lined in perfect symmetry. I scanned the crowd looking for Spencer, then Laurel, then Tobin. He stood at the front in a tailored grey suit, looking older than I remembered. Taller, too. His hair was slicked back, his smile careful, the kind of smile you wear when people are watching. The ceremony began, music played, vows were exchanged. The camera caught every detail, every nervous laugh, every perfectly timed tear. When it came time for the speeches, Spencer stepped forward. He took the mic with ease, said how proud he was of his son, how grateful he and Laurel were for the love that had built their family. Then he turned to look at the table where Laurel's parents sat. He thanked them, said they had not only welcomed Spencer into their family, but had helped lay the foundation for Tobin's future. Said none of this would have been possible without their guidance and generosity. My name was not spoken, not even once. I watched him smile as the camera panned to the Atwaters. Celia dabbed her eyes. Daniel raised his glass. Everyone clapped. And I sat alone in my kitchen with a mug of cold coffee and a silence that felt louder than any applause. He had rewritten the story. That much was clear. And everyone there seemed happy to go along with it. The house I had funded, the support I had given, the love I had offered freely. All of it had been replaced by a cleaner version, a version where I had never been involved. When the video ended, I didn't close the tab right away. I just stared at the blank screen, listening to the buzz of my refrigerator. There was no anger, not yet. Only a dull ache behind my ribs, like something old had cracked open again. I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to the sink. I rinsed my mug slowly, then set it upside down on the drying rack. I had given them everything quietly, and now they had erased me just as quietly. But not everything stays buried. Some truths have a way of coming back up when you least expect them. And I felt something shift that day. Not in them, in me. The Monday after the wedding, I called an old friend named Connie, who worked part-time at the county records office. We hadn't spoken in a few years, but she remembered my voice right away. I told her I needed a copy of a deed, no reason given. She didn't ask, just said she'd email it by end of day. That evening I opened the file on my laptop. There it was. Spencer and Laurel's house. Lot number, street name, square footage, tax ID. Then the part I had been waiting for, the names listed on the deed. Spencer Ronstadt, Laurel Atwater Ronstadt, Daniel Atwater, Celia Atwater, Laurel's parents. Not Evelyn Brook Financial, not my LLC, not my name. No record that the original funds had come from anyone outside their immediate circle. I checked the document again. There was no lien, no mention of secondary financing, nothing. It was as if my $52,800 had never existed. It wasn't just a lack of acknowledgement anymore. It was erasure in its most literal form. Legal, clean, permanent. I clicked to enlarge the signatures. Spencer's looked rushed, like he had signed it without reading. Laurel's was careful and curved. Daniel and Celia's names were neat, practiced, full of confidence. They had been added during a revision filed nearly a year ago, quietly, without ceremony. I sat still for a long time, reading every line twice. The legal language was cold, efficient, no warmth, no room for sentiment. I remembered how it started, the night Spencer called asking for help. His voice strained, embarrassed. He said the loan had fallen through, that Laurel was devastated. He didn't ask me outright. He just said we don't know what else to do. I told him I would handle it, that I had some resources. I never mentioned Evelyn Brooke. I wanted him to feel strong, capable, like he had built something himself. But now I saw it for what it was. I had made myself invisible, thinking that would protect the relationship. I had hidden behind paperwork, thinking that would build trust. Instead, it gave them permission to forget. The sharpest betrayal isn't the one that screams, it's the one that smiles while signing you away. I looked over to the envelope still sitting by the sugar jar, the wedding invitation, still unthrown, still untouched. That line through my name seemed bolder now, not just ink, a message. I printed the deed and folded it once clean down the middle. I placed it next to the folder with my payment records. I didn't know what I would do with them yet, but I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. They had crossed my name out once. Now they had crossed it out again, just in a different language. And this time, I didn't feel sadness. I felt ready. A few days later, I visited the art wing of the local historical museum. It wasn't Yale, but it was familiar enough. I had volunteered there off and on since retiring. It was quiet, filled with items no one looked at too closely anymore. Faded quilts, bent spoons. A child's diary from the 1800s, opened to a page where the ink had bled with time. The kind of things people walk past, but I always stopped for. I stood in front of a replica of a Shaker dining table. It was narrow with long benches on either side. Polished wood, smooth as river stone. There were no plates, no utensils, just an empty surface and a handwritten note in a frame. The note described the simplicity of early communal meals where everyone had a seat, everyone had a place. I stared at that table for longer than I meant to, and I realized I had spent most of my life setting the table. Birthdays, holidays, school nights, it's always arranging chairs, wiping the same spots, refilling cups before they were empty. I thought doing that meant I belonged, that by serving I was securing my place, that if I kept the peace and stayed useful no one would ever leave me out. But that's not how belonging works. It doesn't come from what you give. It comes from whether people choose to make room for you. And they hadn't. On the way home, I passed a row of shops. One of them had changed. The old bookstore had turned into a sleek real estate office. The window displayed glossy photos of houses I couldn't afford, next to the smiling faces of agents with perfect teeth. That night, I pulled out every document I had on Evelyn Brooke Financial. Every agreement, every bank record, every transfer receipt. I opened a fresh folder and began labeling it line by line. I checked dates, confirmed amounts, added notes in red pen. The picture sharpened with every sheet. 2 years of silent giving. No signatures tying it back to me. But the money trail was clean. Every payment tied to the mortgage. Every dollar matched. I wasn't listed on the deed, but I had the numbers. And numbers don't lie. At the bottom of one statement, I saw a code. I hadn't noticed it before. It was a refinancing reference. Laurel had refinanced the house 6 months after moving in. That move required her to submit documents about the origin of the initial down payment, which meant she had likely submitted something, or someone had submitted on her behalf. The implication was clear. My silent contribution had been transformed into someone else's declared investment. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, my mind sorting details like puzzle pieces. Not out of revenge, not out of anger, out of clarity. I had spent so long convincing myself that silence was strength, that staying out of sight meant love. But silence can be a hiding place for people who don't want to be remembered, or worse, for people who want you forgotten. In the morning, I made tea and stood in my small kitchen. I looked again at the old envelope by the sugar jar. Then I opened a drawer, pulled out a legal pad, and wrote 4 words at the top of a clean page. No more quiet giving. And I underlined it twice. The next day, I made an appointment with a lawyer named Margaret Lee. Her office was tucked above a florist shop downtown. Nothing flashy, but the windows were always clean. I had asked around quietly and heard she was sharp, discreet, and didn't waste time. That was exactly what I needed. She met me with a firm handshake and didn't blink when I opened my bag and began laying out documents. I didn't tell her the whole story, just enough. The LLC, the payments, the deed, the refinance, the exclusion. She listened without interruption, flipping pages, marking notes. Then she sat back and looked at me like she already knew what I hadn't said yet. After a pause, she spoke carefully, like someone choosing every word for its weight. You are not on the deed, but your money built that house. You were the funding source, and they used your silence to cut you out. I nodded once. Not because I needed her confirmation. I already knew. What I needed now was a path forward. She explained my options. Quiet ones, legal ones. I could pursue financial restitution through the LLC. Technically, Spencer and Laurel had misrepresented the origin of their funds during the refinancing process. That misrepresentation could trigger a legal challenge. I could also send a formal notice of default. Not from me directly, but from Evelyn Brooke Financial. The LLC still existed, it still had standing. I thought about that. She asked if I wanted to proceed. I told her yes. That afternoon she drafted the documents. It didn't take long. The paper trail was clean, the timeline sharp. She included a certified summary of every deposit, every statement, every automatic payment made over 24 months. The notice would arrive in Spencer's mailbox in 3 business days. It would come in a white envelope with a formal letterhead. No mention of my name. Just the LLC. The cold language of breach and enforcement. A reminder that silence did not mean surrender. I left the office carrying a copy of the letter. When I got home, I placed it on the table beside the wedding invitation. The contrast between the two was stark. One wrapped in soft gold and cursive, the other typed in black and white, unflinching. I took a pen and wrote a line across the back of the legal copy. If I am not family enough for a chair at the table, I am not family enough to carry the weight of the roof. Then I folded it once clean and deliberate and placed it in a new envelope marked for my own files. The act didn't feel vengeful. It felt honest. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't cleaning up quietly behind the scenes. I wasn't protecting feelings that never protected mine. I was drawing a line, not in anger, in self-respect. That night I slept deeper than I had in weeks, and when I woke up I didn't check my phone. I didn't rehearse what I might say if someone called. I just made coffee and waited for the silence to shift. 2 mornings after the notice was delivered, the first reaction arrived in the form of a voicemail. Laurel's voice clipped and tight, barely concealed the tremble under the surface. She said she didn't understand what the letter was about, said there must be a mistake, said maybe something had been filed in error. She ended with a forced laugh, like this whole thing was a technical hiccup, a misplaced comma. I didn't call her back. That afternoon, Spencer emailed. 3 lines. I don't know what you're trying to prove. We've always appreciated your support. But this is going too far. He didn't sign it with love, just his name. I read it once, then archived it. I didn't reply. Later that evening, I opened my laptop to check something unrelated and saw a new post from Tobin on social media. It was vague, just a photo of him and Laurel at the wedding, smiling, surrounded by candles and fairy lights. The caption read, "Sometimes family forgets how to be family. We move forward anyway." The comments were filled with hearts and sympathy and affirmations from people who had no idea what they were affirming. I didn't feel anger. What I felt was a deep, quiet confirmation. The image was curated. The caption was performative. But the subtext was sharp. It wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a message. I stepped away from the screen and made tea. While the water boiled, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was the original statement from the LLC bank account. 24 lines, each one a payment, all of them real. This was not about proving anything. It was about balance. I didn't need them to explain. They already had. Every choice, every omission, every signature on that deed had spoken louder than words. Still, I wasn't prepared for the next move. The following day, a letter arrived in my mailbox. Real paper, thick envelope, handwritten address. Inside was a folded card, blank on the front. Inside, 2 sentences from Spencer. "We never asked for the money. You gave it without being asked. That changes things." I held the card in my hand for a long while. Then I read it again. Not an apology, not even resentment, just a new version of the story, one where my generosity became unsolicited, unwanted, even inconvenient. He was rewriting the beginning now, not just the ending. It occurred to me how effortless it had become for them to detach from the truth, to shave off the edges of their memory until only what served them remained. I had been generous in silence, and now that silence was being recast as intrusion. That night, I sat by the window with a blanket over my knees and watched the wind pull the last few leaves from the trees. The branches moved like slow dancers. The street lamps buzzed faintly. Nothing dramatic happened. No knock at the door, no pleading phone calls. Just the quiet acknowledgement that this rift would not be mended with words. Sometimes there is no conversation to have, no reconciliation to stage. Sometimes the only thing left is the space you choose to occupy and the dignity you refuse to trade. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and placed it upside down to dry. Let them write their version. I had already begun living mine. 3 days after the card arrived, Tobin showed up at my front door. No call ahead, no warning, just the sound of his car pulling into the driveway, followed by the soft knock I would have recognized, even if 20 years had passed. I opened the door and there he was. No suit, no polished smile, just jeans, a sweatshirt, and eyes that looked like they hadn't rested. I stepped aside and he walked in without a word. He looked around the living room like it had changed since the last time he was here, though nothing had. Same couch, same clock, same photograph of him at 6 years old with jelly on his chin and a drawing in his hand that said Grandma in crooked letters. He didn't sit, just stood there in the center of the room with his hands in his pockets. After a long pause, he said he heard about the notice, that his parents were upset, that things were getting complicated. I said nothing. He nodded slowly, then looked down at his shoes like he was rehearsing something in his head. Then he looked back up. He said he didn't know the money had come from me. I believed him, and I didn't. He said he remembered the day he and his fiancée found the house, how his parents had said Laurel's side made the down payment, how they said it was a group effort, but mostly the Atwaters. He said he never questioned it. I asked him if he remembered the small loan I gave him when he first moved to New York. $500 to cover the deposit on his studio apartment. He nodded. I asked if he remembered the notebook I gave him when he was 10, the one where he wrote his first story and made me promise not to read it until he was published someday. He smiled, just barely, and said he still had it. Then I asked if he remembered who bought the first bouquet of flowers he gave to Laurel in high school, the one he left on her locker. He froze. I told him it was me, that I slipped him the $20 and told him never to show up empty-handed when it mattered. He looked away. I said I wasn't angry, not in the way he might think, that this wasn't about money. It wasn't even about being left out. It was about being rewritten, about watching my place in his life shrink from something real into something silent. He said he didn't know what to say. I told him I didn't need him to say anything. We stood there in the quiet. No music, no humming appliances, just breath and space and memory stretching out between us. Then he asked if he could help fix things. I told him some things don't need fixing, some things need remembering. He didn't argue. He stayed another 5 minutes, then left as quietly as he came. No hug, no promises. Just a boy I used to hold in my arms, walking back to a car that didn't belong to me. I closed the door gently. Then I sat on the couch and looked at that old photo again. Some wounds do not bleed. They just echo. And sometimes silence says more than words ever could. The week after Tobin left, I made a quiet decision. I closed the Evelyn Brooke account for good. I went to the bank in person. Sat across from a young teller with pink nails and a distracted smile. She typed, quickly asked for ID, and didn't say much else. Within 10 minutes, the account was dissolved. The remaining balance was modest. I asked for it in a check, then tucked it into my purse without looking. That same afternoon, I drove to the library and found an empty corner near the large windows. I pulled out a notebook and wrote down a name I hadn't thought about in years. Frances Whitaker, a woman I once knew from my teaching days. She had gone back to school at 65 to finish her degree after her husband passed. Quiet, determined, brilliant. She had told me once that it wasn't too late to become something new. That memory stayed with me even now. I wrote her name at the top of the page, then drew a line underneath it. Below, I began outlining an idea that had been growing slowly over the last few weeks. A fund. Small at first. Private. A quiet offering for women who had spent their lives giving, raising, supporting, sacrificing. Women who had been overlooked, underestimated, or simply forgotten. The ones who had been told their time was up before they ever had a chance to begin. I called it the Missing Matriarch Fund. Not for show, not for press. Just a way to shift the weight, to give someone else the kind of boost I once gave silently, but this time with intention, with their name on the paperwork, with their place at the table. I contacted a local community college, asked about tuition costs, re-entry programs, what it would take to sponsor a student returning after 50. The counselor I spoke with sounded surprised, then quietly moved. She said she'd never had someone call with that specific request. The next morning I met with Margaret Lee again. This time we weren't discussing breach notices. We were drawing up something new, a legal framework for the fund. Margaret asked what kind of oversight I wanted. I told her I didn't need control. I just wanted structure. And a clear message in every letter of acceptance. You were never invisible. We see you now. By Friday, the paperwork was filed. The account was separate from anything tied to Spencer or the LLC. Clean, independent, just like it should be. I didn't tell anyone in the family. There was no reason to, no need to explain or prove anything. Some acts are louder when carried in silence. That evening I sat by the window as the streetlights flickered on. A woman walked by, pushing a stroller with one hand and holding a phone in the other. I wondered what her story was, what she had given up, what she had hidden for the sake of everyone else. Maybe one day someone like her would apply for the fund, and maybe that small gesture would be enough to remind her she mattered. That was enough for me. I didn't need apologies or revisions. I just needed the next page to be written differently. Winter came quietly that year. The snow didn't arrive all at once, just flurries at first drifting against the windows and softening the edges of everything. My world had gotten quieter too. Not empty, just different. I kept to my rhythms. Tea in the morning, walks when the sidewalks were clear, books from the library even if I reread the same chapters. Some things didn't need to change. The letters for the missing matriarch fund had gone out. Not many, just a few carefully chosen envelopes sent with care. I had no expectation of reply. But one day a card came. It was handwritten, shaky, but firm. A woman named June. She had been accepted into a health sciences program after raising 4 children and surviving cancer. She said the fund made her feel seen. I folded the card and placed it in a drawer beside the old invitation. I hadn't heard from Spencer since his note. Tobin hadn't returned. Laurel never reached out. But I didn't wait for them. Some stories do not close with neat bows. Some chapters end without permission. I stood at the window that evening, watching as the street turned silver. The lights in the houses across the way blinked on, one by one, soft and warm. I had been erased once, quietly. But now I had written something new, also quietly, and that I realized was its own kind of power. If you've ever felt like the world moved on without you, or that your story was edited out of the pages you helped write, I hope this one stayed with you. Let me know if you've ever had to quietly reclaim your place or rewrite your worth after being pushed aside. Your story matters here, always.